The lamp oil in the Nugget Saloon burned cheap and smoky, and through that haze, Xiaolan watched 5 men decide what she was worth without once looking at her face. She stood where Silas Corley had put her, 3 steps behind his chair, her hands folded inside the sleeves of a plum-colored jacket that had been washed until the silk went thin as onion skin. The floorboards were sticky under her cloth shoes. Somewhere behind the bar, a fiddle sawed at a tune nobody danced to. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, on the smoke curling around the antler chandelier, because she had learned in 3 years under Corley's hand that a lowered gaze was a wall she could stand behind. Behind it, she counted. Cards falling, coins scraping, the wet click of Corley's tongue against his teeth when the deal went sour. They were playing for her. She had understood it slowly, the way cold water understands a crack in a jar. First, there had been the ranchers and the freighters filing in out of the Idaho dusk, shaking dust off their coats, and Corley buying rounds too loud, his laugh climbing higher with every hand. Then the pot had swollen past silver into paper, past paper into deeds, and Corley, who owed money in 3 towns and a debt he never named in a 4th, had run dry. She had seen his shoulders go rigid. She had seen him turn in his chair and jerk his chin at her, the way a man points at a horse he means to sell. She cooks, he'd said to the table. She sews. She keeps her mouth shut, which is more than most of you can say for your wives. A gust of laughter. Warmed my house since Portland. She's worth 200 easy, and I'll stake her against the pot. Nobody had told him he couldn't. That was the thing that closed around Xiaolan's throat like a hand. In this room, in this country, there was no law that came running when a man wagered a woman like she was a stack of chips. Least of all, a Chinese woman with no papers and no people. A woman who had crossed the ocean at 17 believing she was to marry a merchant's son, and had instead been passed hand to hand down the coast, like a debt that kept coming due. So she counted the cards, and she did not let her face move, and inside the thin silk her thumbnail dug a small bloody crescent into her palm. Across the table sat a man she did not know. He had come in late and taken the far chair with his back to the wall, and he had not laughed when Corley pointed at her. He was big through the shoulders in the way of men who worked, not men who ate, and his face under a week of beard was weathered to the color of the range outside, burnt umber, cracked at the eyes. There was a stillness to him she didn't trust, because she had learned that still men were often the most dangerous. His hat sat low. He turned his cards with 2 fingers, slow, like a man reading a letter he already knew the ending of. And once, only once, his eyes came up and found hers across all that smoke, and they did not slide down her body the way the others had. They looked at her face, at her, as though there were a person standing behind it. Then he set his cards down, reached into his coat, and laid a folded paper on the table. "Corley," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, gravel over a slow creak. "You want to make it interesting? We'll make it interesting." The room hushed, even the fiddle stopped. "There's the deed to the Bar M," the stranger went on. 400 head, water rights on Slate Creek, and every stick of timber to the ridge. It's everything I've got in this world and then some." He nudged the paper an inch toward the pot. Against her. Xiaolan's heart struck once, hard, like a fist against a door. Corley's wet laugh came again, uncertain now. "You'd stake a whole ranch on." "I'd stake it on a better hand than yours," the stranger said. "Question is, whether you've got the belly to see it." And Xiaolan, who had spent 3 years teaching herself to feel nothing so that Corley could take nothing more from her, stood in the smoke with her nails in her palm and felt something she had thought long dead turn over in her chest, because she did not yet know if this quiet man meant to save her or only to own her, and in that moment she could not have said which frightened her more. The cards fell. She did not see the hands. She saw Corley's face, which was a book she had read too many times, the twitch at the corner of his mouth when a card betrayed him, the way his ears went red before his fists did. She saw it drain from red to a sick gray. She heard the table let out its breath all at once, and she heard the stranger say, still without triumph, still without heat, 3 ladies. "I believe the deed stays in my pocket, and the lady comes with me." Corley came up out of his chair so fast it fell, but the freighters were already whooping, already pounding the table, and the stranger had risen too, unhurried, one hand resting easy near his hip in a way that made Corley's own hand stop halfway to his coat. For a long moment the 2 men measured each other across the ruined pot. Then Corley spat on the floorboards, close to the stranger's boot but not on it, a coward's insult, and said, "She's got a mean streak and a witch's tongue. You'll be glad to be rid of her by spring." "Maybe," said the stranger, "but she won't be yours to be glad about." Xiulan followed him out into the cold because she did not know what else a body could do. The night air hit her wet cheeks, and she realized only then that at some point she had begun, silently, without permission, to cry. His horse was a rangy bay tied to the rail, and a second animal stood beside it, a smaller mare with a blanket already on her back, as though he had come to town expecting to leave with more than he'd arrived with. He did not touch Xiulan. He stood a careful arm's length away in the lantern light spilling from the saloon window, and he took off his hat, which no man had done in front of her since she'd stepped off the boat, and he said, "Name's Jed Mercer. I run the Bar M, north of here, up against the mountains." He turned the hat in his hands. "I want to say a thing plain, so there's no misunderstanding it, and then I'll say it once more in the morning when you've slept and can be sure I meant it." She waited. She had learned to wait for the second half of a kind sentence, because that was where the price usually hid. "You're not one," Jed Mercer said. "I don't hold with a man owning another soul, and I sure as hell don't hold with what just went on in there. But it was the only game those men understood, and I played it to get you out. That's all it was, getting you out." He looked at the mountains, black against a sky thick with stars. "The mare's yours. Come to the ranch tonight because it's 40 miles of nothing and wolves and you've got no cloak. But come morning, if you want the mare and the road and to never lay eyes on me again, you take it. I won't stop you. Nobody at the Bar M will stop you." He put the hat back on. "You crossed an ocean once. I figure you can find your own way from here if you've a mind to." He turned and swung up onto the bay and waited, giving her the choice of the mare or the dark. And Xiulan stood in the trampled snow between the two horses with the whole enormous night pressing down on her, and could not for the life of her understand why her hands had begun to shake now, when the danger was past, unless it was because in 3 years no one had told her she was free to leave, and she no longer knew how to hold a thing so large. They rode north through the dark and did not speak. The cold was a living thing that got its fingers into the seams of her thin jacket and squeezed, and after an hour Jed Mercer stopped without a word, unrolled a heavy wool blanket from behind his saddle, and passed it across the gap between the horses. Their hands did not touch. He was careful that they did not. She wrapped herself in the smell of horse and wood smoke and lanolin and rode on, and she watched the back of this stranger who had bet the only thing he owned on the turn of a card, and she tried to find the trick in it, because there was always a trick. The Bar M rose out of the dark before dawn. A long, low ranch house of squared logs, a barn, corrals, the black shapes of cattle bedded down on the white slope beyond. A single window glowed amber. An old man came out onto the porch with a lantern held high, and behind him a boy of maybe 9, tousled and sleep-drunk, who took one look at Xiulan and said with the terrible honesty of children, "Pa, is she the new one?" Jed's jaw went tight under his hat brim. "She's a guest, Toby. Mind your manners." Xiulan's eyes went from the boy to the man and back, and something old and cold shifted in her. A widower then, a ready-made need for a woman's hands, cooking, mending, minding a motherless child through a mountain winter. She almost laughed. So this was the trick after all, and it was the oldest trick in the world, dressed up prettier than most. He had not bought a chattel. He had bought a wife who cost him nothing but a hand of cards, and in the morning, he would say his fine words about freedom knowing she had nowhere on God's earth to go. She slept that night in a small clean room with a bar on the inside of the door that she did not use, and she lay awake listening to the house settle and the wind come down off the peaks, and she made her heart into a stone again, because a stone could not be disappointed. But in the morning Jed Mercer said it once more, exactly as he'd promised. He said it in the gray kitchen with the boy Toby watching from the stairs and the old man, Amos, the foreman, 40 years on that range, pretending to fuss with the stove. Jed set a tin cup of coffee in front of her, and a plate with more food on it than she had been given in a week, and he stood back against the wall with his own cup and said, "Mare's saddled if you want her. There's a satchel of provisions on her and $11 in it, which is what I've got in coin, and Amos'll ride you as far as the stage road so you're not alone on it." He drank. "Or you can stay through the winter as hired help, wages same as any hand, your own room, your own door, and come spring, you'll have your own money and the whole world to spend it in." Either way, you're nobody's but your own from this minute." He set the cup down. "That's the last I'll say about it. Didn't want it hanging over you." And Xiulan, who had rehearsed a stone's silence, heard her own voice come out of her rough and unused. "Why?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the thing under all the questions. Jed Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because a long time ago, I stood in a room and let something happen to somebody I should have stood up for, and I didn't, because standing up would have cost me. And it has cost me, every day since, more than any ranch is worth." His eyes went to the window, to the white slope. Turned out the price of doing nothing was higher than the price of the bar M. So when Corley pointed at you and nobody moved, he stopped. He picked up his hat off the peg. "I've got cattle to see to," he said, and went out into the cold, and did not finish it. But he had said enough that Xiulan set down the satchel she had not realized she'd picked up, and she stayed. Telling herself it was the $11, telling herself it was the wolves and the 40 miles, telling herself anything at all except the truth, which was that she wanted, just once, to see how the sentence ended. The winter closed over the bar M like a lid. She cooked, because she was good at it, and because idle hands frightened her. And the men ate what she made. Millet she found in a barrel and made into congee. Biscuits she learned from Amos. A stew she doctored with wild ginger dug from under the snow at the creek. And the boy Toby, who had begun by watching her the way you watch a snake, began instead to hang about the kitchen asking the names of things. She taught him 3 words of Cantonese, and he taught her to whittle. Amos, gruff as a January morning, thawed by degrees over her cooking, and one afternoon said, apropos of nothing, "Jed's a good man. Whatever else you're thinking about him, put that in the scale." And she had said nothing, but she had put it in the scale. Jed himself she saw at dawn and dusk and mealtimes, and never once did his hand find a reason to brush hers, never once did his eyes take a liberty. He treated her with a courtesy so complete it began, perversely, to wound her, because a woman braced against being grabbed does not know what to do with a man who will not even look too long. She caught herself watching for it. She caught herself, one blue evening, holding out his plate a half-second longer than she needed to, just to see if his fingers would linger. They did not. He said thank you, and carried it to the far end of the table, and she stood at the stove with her ears burning, and was furious at herself in a language none of them spoke. There was a jade pendant she wore under her jacket, hung on a red cord, gone brown with age. The only thing that had crossed the ocean with her, her mother's, pressed into her hand on a dock in Guangdong with the words, "Be a jade among stones, hard and pure, and let no man's mud stick to you." She had kept it hidden under Corley because he took beautiful things. Now, in the warm kitchen, with the snow ticking at the window, she found herself taking it out to hold while she worked. And one evening, Toby saw it and asked what it was. And before she could answer, Jed said quietly from the doorway, "That's hers, Toby. A man doesn't ask after what's a woman's to keep private." And Xiulan's hand closed over the warm stone, and she looked at Jed Mercer across the lamplit room, and for the first time, she let her eyes rest on his face as long as they wanted to. And he let her, and neither of them looked away, and the snow ticked, and Toby whittled, and something in the room shifted onto ground the frontier had no name for. Then Silas Corley came back. He came in February, when the passes were choked and no sane man traveled, and he did not come alone. He came with a paper of his own and 2 hard men from Lewiston, and a story he'd been telling in every saloon between here and the river, that the Mercer Ranch was harboring an indentured Chinawoman who'd run out on a lawful debt, that he'd paid good money for her contract in Portland, that a wager made drunk didn't signify against a signed bond. It was a lie stitched from a scrap of truth, and on the frontier, a lie stitched from a scrap of truth could hang a man or worse. Xiulan knew it the moment she saw Corley's sled come up the white road, knew it in her stomach before her mind caught up, and she went cold all over standing at the window with a wooden spoon still in her hand. Jed met them in the yard with Amos at his shoulder and the boy locked inside, and Xiulan watched through the glass as Corley waved his paper and his voice carried thin across the snow. "Bond and contract and the law's a-coming, and you'll swing for a thief and a liar, Mercer." And she watched Jed Mercer stand there in the cold and take it, his hands loose at his sides, and she understood with a lurch that this was the room he had told her about. This was the moment a man either stood up or paid the price of doing nothing for the rest of his life. She saw his shoulders. She saw them not move, and she was already moving herself, out the door into the killing cold with no cloak, because she would be damned before she let another human being lose everything on account of her a second time. "There is no contract," she said, and her voice cut the yard like a struck bell, and every man there turned because they had never once heard her speak above a murmur. "I signed nothing in Portland. I made no mark. He took me off a boat where another man had already sold me, and there was no paper, because a man does not write a paper for a thing he means to pretend he never did." She was shaking, but not, she realized, with fear. "Show them," she said to Corley, in front of his own hired men, in front of God and the mountains. "Show them my name. Show them my mark. You cannot, because it does not exist, because I do not exist to your law, except as something to be spent." Corley's face went the sick gray she knew from the card table. His hired men shifted. A bond was worth blood. A bald lie exposed in the open was worth nothing, and no man rode into a mountain winter to die for another man's nothing. One of the Lewiston men said, low, "Silas, you told us there was paper," and there was a new and dangerous flatness in it. But Corley had never in his life known when to fold. His hand went inside his coat. What happened then happened in the space of 2 breaths, and Julan would carry it the rest of her life in pieces. The black shape of the pistol clearing the coat. Jed Mercer moving faster than a big man had any right to, not toward his own gun, but toward her, putting the whole broad shield of his body between Julan and the muzzle. The flat crack rolling off the barn wall. Amos's rifle answering it a half-beat later. Corley going down in the trampled snow with a sound more surprised than pained. And Jed staggering, one hand pressed to his side, blood already black between his fingers in the white morning, going to one knee in front of her, with his hat fallen off and his face gone the color of ash. She caught him. She did not decide to. Her body decided. She went down into the snow with 200 pounds of bleeding rancher in her arms, and she pressed her own hand over his where the blood came, and she was saying something, over and over, and it took her a moment to hear that it was his name, that she was saying Jed, Jed, in the plain, flat American way, no longer stranger, no longer the man who won her, just Jed, as though if she said it enough times it would tie him to the earth. The Lewiston men were already gone, dragging Corley's groaning weight to the sled, wanting no part of a killing over a lie. Amos was shouting for Toby, for hot water, for the whiskey, and Sheilon knelt in the red snow, with Jed Mercer's head against her shoulder, and her mother's jade pendant swinging free of her jacket to hang between them, and she pressed her mouth to his cold forehead. The first time she had willingly touched a man since the ocean, and she said, low and fierce, in the language he could not understand and did not need to, that he was not permitted to die, that she had not come all this way and buried her heart under a stone all these years, only to dig it up in this exact moment and have it stop. He did not die. The bullet had gone through the meat above his hip and out the back, and it took him 3 weeks flat on his back and a fever that climbed for 2 nights and broke on the 3rd at dawn. And through all of it, Sheilon did not leave the room, except to boil the bitter dark medicine she brewed from her small hoard of dried root and bark, and the things she sent Amos 20 miles to buy from a Chinese herbalist in the mining camp. She had learned it from her grandmother in a courtyard that smelled of camphor, a world and an ocean away, and she had never thought to use it to keep an American rancher on the earth. She changed the dressing. She spooned broth. She held him down when the fever made him fight the blankets. And once, deep in it, he grabbed her wrist and looked at her with eyes that saw someone else and said a name, Ellen, and wept, and told the empty air he was sorry, that he should have spoken, that he'd let them take her, and say she'd fallen, and he'd known it was a lie and said nothing. And so Xiulan learned the shape of his wound, the real one, the one older than the bullet. A first wife, a brutal man, a brother, she pieced together later, from Amos, a brother dead now of his own meanness. And a night Jed had stood in a doorway, a boy too afraid of his own blood to cross it, and a woman in the ground by spring, and a motherless child, and a man who had sold every soft thing in himself, and bought a hard life on a hard mountain as penance. He had not saved Ellen, So he had bet a ranch on a card to save a stranger, because it was the only door the world had left open to him to set it right. Xiulan sat by his bed in the gray hours and understood, finally, that she had been looking for the trick in a man who had none. Only a debt to his own conscience as heavy as the one she carried across the sea. Two people from two ends of the earth, each of them owing a ghost. She took his hot hand in both of her cool ones and held it, and did not let go. And when the fever broke, and his eyes came back to himself, and found her sitting there, worn to the bone, still holding on, he did not pull the hand away. "You're still here," he said, hoarse. "The mare was cold," she said. "I did not want to trouble her." And Jed Mercer, gray and gaunt and alive, laughed until his stitches pulled, and the sound of it filled the little room like light. Spring came up the mountain slow, and with it a question neither of them would say. He healed. He went back to the cattle too soon, as men do, and she scolded him in two languages, and he took to standing in the kitchen doorway at dusk, with his hat in his hands, watching her cook, saying nothing, needing no reason. The careful arm's length between them had become something else. Not a wall now, but a held breath, a distance that both of them maintained the way you cup a flame against wind, because the moment it closed, it could never be reopened, and neither of them yet dared to be sure. Toby had begun, without asking anyone, to call her by her name. The word for what she had become had no place in the ledger where Amos kept the wages. It was Amos in the end, blunt as a fence post, who forced the thing into daylight. He found her at the creek one evening rinsing a kettle, the jade warm at her throat, and he said, "Girl, that man out there loved his first wife wrong. Too late, too quiet, too scared to say a word till she was gone. He spent 9 years believing he doesn't get another one. You aim to let him die believing that, you take the mare come morning like he offered. But if you don't aim to," the old man spat, embarrassed, "then for the love of God, one of you say the plain thing, because I'm too old to watch two people freeze to death an arm's length from a fire." She found Jed that night on the porch, watching the last light bleed off the peaks. The ranch he had wagered spread out gold and blue below them. She came and stood beside him at the rail, close, closer than the careful arm's length, close enough that he went very still, the way still men do. "You said I was not one," she said. Her heart was going like a bird against a cage, but her voice held. "You said come spring, I could take the mare and the road and never see you again." "I did." His voice was rough. His hands gripped the rail. "It still stands. It'll always stand. I know it stands." She turned to him in the blue dark, and she took her mother's jade from around her neck, the hard, pure thing that had crossed the ocean, the thing she had hidden from every man who would have taken it, and she pressed it into his big, scarred hand and closed his fingers over it, the way her mother had closed her own fingers on a dock a lifetime ago. "So hear me say it where I am not one, and no card decides it, and no man owns me. I am not taking the road." Her throat closed and she pushed the words through it anyway. "I am choosing the porch. I am choosing the boy asleep inside, and the old man who scolds us both, and the fool who put a ranch on a card for a woman he had never spoken a word to." She looked up at him. "I am choosing you, Jed Mercer, not because you saved me, because when the whole world said we could never, you were the only man who ever asked me what I wanted." For a moment, he did not move at all, and she felt the old fear rise, that she had read the trick wrong, that even now the price would show itself. Then his free hand came up, slow, giving her every instant to step back, and cupped the side of her face, his calloused thumb catching a tear she hadn't known was falling, and he bent his head and pressed his forehead to hers, the way she had pressed hers to him in the red snow. And he said, so low she felt it more than heard it, "I've been ready to say it since the night you spoke up in that yard and shamed the fear right out of me. I just didn't have the right, till you had the free will to hear it." His breath shook. "I love you, Xiulan. Not as a bride I won, as the bravest soul I ever stood next to. Marry me, and let the whole town choke on it." The whole town did not choke on it, though a good part of it tried. They married in the spring, in the yard where the blood had gone into the snow, an itinerant preacher stammering over the strangeness of it, and Amos glaring anyone toward silence who looked inclined to comment. There were those in the valley who never crossed the Barem's line again, who spat the word Chinawoman, and worse, who let it be known that Jed Mercer had disgraced a good ranch. Xiulan had braced for all of it, and it came, and it did not touch what mattered, because she went home each night to a house of squared logs where a boy called her by her name, and a man reached for her hand across the supper table, without once looking to see who watched. Corley did not trouble them again. He had lived. Amos's shot had gone shoulder high, but a man exposed as a liar in front of his own hired guns is a man with nothing left to spend, and word came in summer that he'd drifted south and drunk himself out of the country. His name, in time, became a thing they simply did not say, the way you do not say the word for a storm once it has passed the mountains. The years came on the way they do in that high country, hard and beautiful and fast. There was a herbalist's garden Xiulan planted along the south wall, ginger and mint and things she'd carried as seed sewn into her hem across an ocean, and half the valley, even the ones who'd spat, came in time to knock at the Bar M's kitchen door in the gray of a sick morning, hats in hand, asking the Chinawoman for the bitter dark medicine that broke a fever no white doctor could. There was Toby, grown tall and easy, who at 15 thrashed a boy in town for a slur, and came home bloody and unrepentant and got no scolding worth the name. There were 2 more children in time, black-haired, dust-footed, at home on a horse before they could rightly walk, who grew up speaking English in the yard and Cantonese in their mother's kitchen, and thinking nothing strange in it at all. There was a red paper lantern that hung by the ranch house door and glowed each dusk against the enormous blue dark, a small stubborn warmth in a great cold country, so that a rider coming up the north road in the last light would see it long before the house and know that whatever else the frontier was, someone there was waiting. And there was Jed, grayer, slower, the old wound aching before rain, but never once in all those years did his hand find a reason not to close over hers. On a certain evening near the end of a certain autumn, an old woman sat on that porch with a jade pendant warm in her palm, for he had given it back to her on their wedding night, saying a thing so private it belonged to no one else's ears, and watched the light go gold and then blue over 400 head of cattle on a slope that had once, for the space of a single hand of cards, been staked against her freedom. Her husband came out and lowered himself beside her with a grunt, and she tucked the jade away and took his hand, and they sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have long since said everything and go on saying it anyway. "You know," he said, "Corley told me you had a witch's tongue. Said I'd be glad to be rid of you by spring." "He was right about the tongue," she said. Jed laughed his slow laugh, the one she'd first heard through the fog of his fever. "Best bet I ever made," he said, "and I never even looked at my cards." "You looked at me," she said. "That was the whole of it. In all that room full of men, you were the only one who looked at me." And the red lantern came alight against the dark, the way it had every dusk for 30 years, and she leaned her white head against his shoulder and let the mountain wind carry the day away. "Now I want to ask you something, my friend, before the fire burns down and the lantern needs its light. If you had been in that smoky saloon, in a hard country that said 2 people like them must never meet, would you have had the courage to stake everything you owned, not to keep a soul, but to set one free? And would you have been brave enough, given the road and the open door, to choose the porch instead?" Xiulan crossed an ocean to find out what she was worth, and it took a quiet man betting a whole fortune to show her that the answer was never his to decide, only his to make sure she got to choose. If her story warmed something in you tonight, stay a while by this fire with me. Leave a comment and tell me, would you have chosen the road or the porch? And if you want more sweeping tales of brave hearts who crossed oceans and prairies to find a love the world said they could never have, subscribe and pull your chair a little closer. There's always another lantern waiting to be lit.